Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Bunker. In this video, I want to talk to you about 1914, specifically the claims made by Jehovah's Witnesses about 1914. And interestingly, a few weeks ago, Jehovah's Witnesses posted to their website a 5-minute video summarizing what these claims are. The video is titled, God's Kingdom Began Ruling in 1914. And I don't want to spoil what you're going to see, but it was a fascinating example of trickery, of bad arguments, of logical fallacies. And I thought it might be helpful for those of you watching who might think there might be something to 1914. It might be helpful to go through this video step by step to show you how easily it unravels when we expose it to the mildest scrutiny. So without further ado, let's roll the first clip.
Ever since the first humans rejected Jehovah God as ruler, our world has been plagued with evil and suffering. But Jesus offered hope. He taught that as King of God's kingdom, he would restore peace and justice to the earth. But when would that kingdom begin to rule? According to the Bible, it is ruling right now. How do we know that? Consider what happened over 2,600 years ago. Jehovah God caused Nebuchadnezzar, a king of ancient Babylon, to have a prophetic dream. In the dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw a giant tree that reached all the way to heaven. The tree was cut down, but its stump was left in the ground. After a period of 7 times, the tree grew again. The Bible indicates that this dream would have 2 fulfillments. The first had to do with King Nebuchadnezzar himself. He was very prominent, like the tree that reached all the way to heaven, but he was cut down for 7 times. This happened when Nebuchadnezzar lost his sanity for 7 years. During that time, he was unable to rule as king. At the end of the 7 times, Nebuchadnezzar regained his sanity and started ruling again. That was the first fulfillment of this prophecy.
So what we've just been hearing in the last minute or so is essentially foundational to the claims made by Jehovah's Witnesses about 1914. It all hinges on this Bible verse in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 4, in which Nebuchadnezzar has a dream about a tree. I go over this in my video 607 BCE and 1914, Why These Dates Matter to Jehovah's Witnesses, thumbnail here if Tibor is gracious. There's going to be a lot of overlap between that video and this video. Please check it out if you've not seen this already. As I say in that video, when you examine Daniel chapter 4 on its own terms, it is describing a king having a dream, and that dream being interpreted to mean that he will go crazy for a while. That's what Daniel chapter 4 says. But notice the claim that's made in this video.
The Bible indicates that this dream would have 2 fulfillments.
The Bible claims that this dream will have 2 fulfillments, and notice the verse in the bottom left of the screen there that's supposed to indicate that this dream will have 2 fulfillments. Daniel chapter 4, verse 17. Let's go to that verse. Quite frankly, I don't think the makers of this video are expecting you to drill down and look at the scriptures they are flinging at you. Let's actually read this verse, and let's read it in context, starting in verse 16. Let its heart, that's the tree's heart, be changed from that of a human, and let it be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over it, this is by the decree of watchers, and the request is by the word of the holy ones, so that people living may know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdom of mankind, and that he gives it to whomever he wants, and he sets up over it even the lowliest of men. I ask any of you watching this, particularly those who are watching who might be Jehovah's Witnesses, where does it say in that verse, this dream will have 2 fulfillments? I've not seen that anywhere. What I've seen is language indicating that the purpose of Nebuchadnezzar's madness will be to show Nebuchadnezzar who's boss. I'm going to show Nebuchadnezzar who is boss. I'm going to show Nebuchadnezzar that I, God, am the most high ruler in the kingdom of mankind by making you humiliate yourself by thinking you're an animal for a period of time. That's what I've read in that verse. There is nothing in that language whatsoever that hints at a second fulfillment to this dream. And in fact, when we read on in the same chapter, we get an emphatic statement to the contrary in Daniel chapter 4, verse 28, where it simply says, all of this befell King Nebuchadnezzar. If you're God and you are trying to pass on your master plan to mankind, you have an elaborate plan involving world history and involving a period of, quote, Gentile times when rulership would be passed to people who are not under the influence of God, a line of rulers that are ruling without God so that Jesus can intervene in the future. If you have this plan and you're communicating it through a dream, you're surely going to make clear in the dream that there is a second fulfillment. But that's not made clear here. And in fact, what it does say in the chapter is that there is only one fulfillment. All of this befell King Nebuchadnezzar. So straight away, with minimal scrutiny, applying basic critical thinking, the entire premise of the argument surrounding 1914 completely falls to pieces. I mean, we'll press on with the video because, again, it's a great example of just bad argument being layered upon bad argument. But if you are watching this as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, I would just ask you to please be honest about this and allow the Bible to speak for itself here. The verses that are being pointed to in support of 1914 simply do not say what the makers of this video claim they say.
What was the second fulfillment? It had to do with God's rulership. The Bible says that kings in ancient Israel sat on Jehovah's throne. In other words, they represented God and his rulership. However, most of those kings became disobedient to Jehovah, and so did most of their subjects. Because of their disobedience, God allowed the Israelites to be conquered by the Babylonians, who destroyed the city of Jerusalem in 607 BCE. From that time on, no more kings represented Jehovah in Jerusalem. Thus, 607 BCE marked the beginning of the 7 times, or the period when God's rulership would be interrupted. That period would last until Jehovah installed a new king to represent him. This time, someone in heaven. When would that happen?
Okay, before I let the narrator answer that question, I hope you don't mind if we just go back and highlight an entirely wrong piece of information that has just been inserted in this video as fact, let's look back at what was said about the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians.
God allowed the Israelites to be conquered by the Babylonians, who destroyed the city of Jerusalem in 607 BCE.
That is simply not true. The makers of this video are at this point not just making up false narratives about obscure Bible dreams, they are indulging in misinformation. So if you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses, please investigate this. Please think about this objectively. If this video is accurate and if it contains credible information, when it touches on history, what's being said should align with what historians and archaeologists are saying. After all, why would historians and archaeologists give wrong information about history, but the makers of this video, who aren't historians and aren't archaeologists, give correct information when it comes to dates in ancient history? As it turns out, when you actually investigate the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians under the command of Nebuchadnezzar, you find out that this didn't happen in 607 BCE. It in fact happened in 587 BCE, 20 years later. I made a video about this. Again, I mentioned at the beginning the 607 1914 video, in which I go into more detail as to how it is we know this happened. Because when we're talking about ancient history, I think we can feel tempted to think, well, maybe it did happen in 607. No one was around then. No one can remember that far back. So maybe, just by coincidence, just through some fluke, the makers of this video are right, and historians and archaeologists all happen to be wrong. Because it's just Jehovah's Witnesses, by the way, who say this. Let's just be clear on that. Jehovah's Witnesses and their apologists are the only ones who say this. Whereas historians and archaeologists say, no, it happened in 587. You could be tempted to think, well, no one can remember that far back. Maybe the Jehovah's Witnesses are right. Well, it turns out that if you're going to pick a period in ancient history in which to fake a date of something happening, a significant event, the last era you would pick would be that of the Neo-Babylonian era, because the people at that time recorded absolutely everything that was going on in tedious detail on thousands and thousands of cuneiform tablets. So tablets made with clay and with wedge-shaped markings made in the clay. They would record business transactions, they would record who was ruling, significant events. Everything got recorded on these cuneiform tablets, including, in some cases, the positions of the moon and certain constellations, so that when you put that data in to astronomical calculations, you can actually corroborate, you can find out exactly what year in history is being described due to the observations that are being made. And there isn't any room to just insert an event or to add or subtract 20 years just to suit your arguments. So the 587 date that has been arrived at by historians is absolutely concrete. You can't shift it. Jehovah's Witnesses are the only ones who want to, and that's because they have a religious bias. Because the teaching that's being presented to us actually goes back to the 19th century using borrowed theology from previous groups, as I'm going to go into later. Bottom line, there really is no basis whatsoever for suggesting that Jerusalem was destroyed in 607 BCE by the Babylonians. This is wrong information. And you have to ask the question, what does it say about an organization that would try to recruit people using wrong information? It would be the minimum you would expect in a video like this would be for the makers to say, actually, just to make this clear, we are the only ones who say this. But we feel that we're right and historians and archaeologists are wrong. It would be at least a little bit more honest for them to say that. But because they're in the business of manipulating people and duping people, they're not going to be transparent. They're just going to spit out a date and trust that the viewer watching this doesn't know much about the ancient Middle East and will just go along with whatever dates they're presented.
In the second fulfillment of this prophecy, the 7 times must be more than 7 literal years. How do we know? For one thing, nothing significant relating to God's rulership happened 7 years after Jerusalem was destroyed.
I want you to just stop and think about that for a moment, what was just said. How do we know that it wasn't 7 literal years, this period that was supposedly foretold in Daniel chapter 4? How do we know it's not just 7 literal years moving forward from 607? And the narrator says,
for one thing, nothing significant relating to God's rulership happened 7 years after Jerusalem was destroyed.
Nothing significant relating to God's rulership happened 7 years after Jerusalem was destroyed. That you know of. And this kind of baffles me, because if you think about it, where all this is going is that this period of 7 times supposedly culminated in 1914. And they're saying the reason why we know it wasn't 7 literal years after 607 is, oh, well, nothing significant relating to God's rulership happened then. Which begs the question, well, how can you prove that something significant relating to God's rulership happened in 1914? And yes, we all know World War I began in 1914. We know that. But what does that have to do with God's rulership? And where all this is going, of course, and the reason why 1914 and 607 are such important dates to Jehovah's Witnesses is because all of this relates to the power of the governing body. All of this relates to the claim of the governing body to be a channel, to be a faithful slave who represents God. This is where they get their power from, ultimately, all of this that we're hearing. So my question would be, okay, you're saying nothing significant relating to God's rulership happened 7 years after 607. If you're making that claim about 1914, where is your objective proof? Maybe you are studying with a Jehovah's Witness and they show you this video. That would be my question to them. And if they come back and say, World War I began in 1914, I would say, no, the question was significant. What happened that's significant relating to God's rulership? And they're not going to be able to answer that satisfactorily, because ultimately the answer to all of this is, certain things happened organizationally a few years after 1914, in 1919, when some directors got released from jail, that was significant to Jehovah's Witnesses. And if it's significant to Jehovah's Witnesses, it's significant to God's rulership. So it's a very, very back to front way of reasoning. And it's again evidence for me that when you scrutinize the words of this video, it's obvious that the audience is being manipulated.
Nothing significant relating to God's rulership happened 7 years after Jerusalem was destroyed. And centuries later, Jesus indicated that the 7 times had not yet ended. In a prophecy about the last days, Jesus said that Jerusalem, or God's rulership, would be trampled on by the nations until the appointed times of the nations are fulfilled. The appointed times of the nations are the same as the 7 times.
So at this point, the makers of this video are literally putting words in the mouth of Jesus. I'm sorry, that's what we've just seen. Look at this screen here. Appointed times of the nations. That's what was said in Luke 21, verse 24. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the nations until the appointed times of the nations are fulfilled. And they just go ahead and say, you know what? He said appointed times of the nations, but what he meant to say, bless him, he doesn't make things clear sometimes, Jesus. But don't worry, we'll fill in for him. What Jesus meant to say was 7 times, because we're trying to prove that all of this has to do with a period of rule by Gentiles, by the nations, leading up to 1914, when Jesus would step in and restore divine rule that had been taken away when the line of kings in Judah was defeated. I think Jesus would have been capable of expressing himself clearly. And I think that if Jesus wanted to tie in the Gentile times, or the 7 times, he would have been capable of saying that. He would have been capable of saying, by the way, for the purposes of clarity, I'm referring to the 7 times. I'm referring to the prophecy in Daniel. He could have said words like that. Instead, he just talks about the appointed times of the nations. The nations have an appointed amount of time that's going to run out. Doesn't have to mean anything to do with 7 times. It doesn't have to tie in to Daniel chapter 4. What we're getting here is presuppositional arguments. In fact, this whole video is a brilliant example of just saying, presupposing this to be the case, it follows that this is true. Well, why should we presuppose? Why should we presuppose that Daniel chapter 4 has 2 fulfillments? Why should we presuppose that Jesus meant the 7 times? It's all total speculation. And when you look at this from the point of view of a Christian or someone who venerates Christ as a teacher, or even as God, as some do, it's kind of blasphemous in a way to suggest that Jesus isn't capable of expressing himself clearly and to put words in the mouth of Jesus, which is, again, what they've resorted to at this point.
When would those times end? The Bible book of Revelation says that 3.5 times equal 1,260 days.
I'm going to pause the video there because we've just heard that 3.5 times equals 1,260 days. And the verse that's being given in support of this is Revelation 12, verses 6 and 14, which does indeed refer to a period of 1,260 days and refers to the same period as being 3.5 times. What I want to show you now is a chart which actually featured in the 607 video that I alluded to earlier. And if you look further down the chart to the right-hand side, it's kind of hard to make out, but you can see there the figure 1260, and it's in tiny, tiny print, but just to the right of it, you can see that it says Revelation 12, verse 6. So the reason why I'm showing you this chart is because this chart was put together by William Miller, and he used similar numbers to come up with a completely different year for the second coming of Christ. So he's throwing around some of the same numbers, in this case 1260 days. We're going to show another number that's going to come up soon in this video. He's throwing around these numbers and these verses, and if you go to the bottom of the chart, you can see that all of this was supposed to point to 1843 as being the return of Christ. This number got revised to 1844, and 1844 went down in history as being the year of the Great Disappointment, because, surprise, surprise, there was no such thing that happened. Christ didn't return in 1844, and it was called the Great Disappointment because his followers were greatly disappointed, especially those who'd sold their businesses and sold their homes and made themselves destitute in expectation of a rapture that never happened. So this chart should hopefully indicate to any Jehovah's Witnesses watching that everything we're seeing in this video and all of this argumentation is borrowed. It's recycled from previous preachers, from previous denominations. Charles Taze Russell picked up his theology from Nelson Barber, who picked his theology up from William Miller, because Nelson Barber was a Millerite. He was among those who was disappointed in the Great Disappointment. But rather than just say, well, I'm going to avoid, crackpots and charlatans who tout obscure Bible texts as a reason to prepare for the second coming, rather than being pragmatic, Nelson Barber said, you know what, I'm going to try and do better. I'm going to try and come up with my own theology. So Barber came up with his own theology that pointed to 1874 and later 1878. And one iteration of these calculations pointed to 1914, and that's the one that Charles Taze Russell really got behind. But all of this, the reason why I'm saying this is because this chart, I think, graphically demonstrates that nothing we're hearing in the video, in the God's Kingdom Began Ruling in 1914 video, is new. It's all recycled. There's nothing revelatory or authentic or truly original about the mechanisms for arriving at specific dates in the relatively recent past. It's all borrowed chronology, borrowed end times hysteria that is a vestige of Charles Taze Russell and the 19th century crackpots who influenced him.
3.5 times equal 1,260 days. So 7 times is double that number, or 2,520 days. In Bible prophecy, a day can represent a year. That is the case with the prophecy about the 7 times. They represent 2,520 years.
If you say so. Well, I've paused it again because we've just learned that there is a special number that we need to think about. This number, 2,520, which we can apparently convert from days to years based on a Bible verse, which I will come to. But first, let's go back to the William Miller chart. I already pointed out that one of the numbers that's touted by Jehovah's Witnesses also appears on this chart, the 1,260 days. Let's go to the top of the chart. Oh, look, 2,520 mentioned there prominently twice, with in smaller letters 7 times next to it. So again, borrowed theology, borrowed ideas from 19th century crackpots, in this case, someone who used these numbers to point to 1844 for the second coming of Christ. And now Jehovah's Witnesses are saying, you know what, the numbers were right, but the math is a little bit wrong. We've managed to tweak it, and we've managed to come up with the correct formula. Well, do you not think it's more likely that the whole thing is based on nonsense to begin with, because we're arriving at this whole concept of 7 times being a significant period through a misreading of Daniel chapter 4. We're suggesting there has to be 2 fulfillments to a Bible verse that says, here's the fulfillment, a king went crazy. So exactly the same mistakes are being made again. History is repeating itself. But I want to show you another example of the makers of this video being utterly dishonest. Notice what gets said about the basis for changing it from 2,520 days to 2,520 years.
In Bible prophecy, a day can represent a year.
In Bible prophecy, a day can represent a year, and we're given there Ezekiel 4, verse 6. Again, I don't think they're expecting people to look these verses up. And if people do look these verses up, I don't think they're expecting people to read the verses in context. What do we find when we look up Ezekiel? Let's start from the top of the chapter, because again, I think context is important. Ezekiel chapter 4, and you, son of man, take a brick and put it in front of you. Engrave on it a city, Jerusalem. Lay siege to it. We're laying siege to a brick at this point. Build a siege wall against it. Raise up a siege rampart against it. Set up camps against it, and surround it with battering rams. Take an iron griddle and place it as an iron wall between you and the city. Then set your face against it, and it will be under siege. You are to besiege it. This is a sign to the house of Israel. Then you should lie on your left side and lay the guilt of the house of Israel on yourself. You will carry their guilt for the number of days that you lie on your side. And I will impose on you 390 days corresponding to the years of their guilt, and you will carry the guilt of the house of Israel, and you must complete them. Then for a second time you will lie down on your right side, and you will carry the guilt of the house of Judah for 40 days. A day for a year is what I have given you. This verse is being used to suggest that 2,520 days should be considered years, because apparently once something along those lines is said somewhere in the Bible, that's the rule. Well, what's being described here? Some weird ritual is being prescribed for the prophet Ezekiel, where he has to lay siege to a brick and lie in certain positions for certain amounts of days, with the days denoting years. Obviously, this can be a one-off. This is, again, presuppositional argumentation. presupposing Daniel chapter 4 to have two meanings, presupposing that the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in 607, presupposing that it's a day for a year, that 2,520 days must be 2,520 years, and that this obscure verse in Ezekiel has some relation to the prophecy in Daniel. Presupposing all of these things, it follows that we ask you to accept our conclusions. You don't have to accept these conclusions. You shouldn't accept these conclusions. They are based on presuppositional arguments. This is manipulation. And again, they flash this scripture up, Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 6. And if you were to just look up the verse, thinking, oh, I'm going to check this out for myself, and land in verse 6 where it says, a day for a year is what I have given you, you're going to think, oh, okay, well, it says that in the Bible, so it must be referring to the prophecy in Daniel. Clearly, that's not what is being referred to in this text. They've just found some words in the Bible that help them to create a different time span, a time span that suits them, because it wouldn't suit them for it to be 2,520 literal days from the destruction of Jerusalem. It would be more helpful if those could be years, because then it gets dragged into the more recent history, into the 20th century at least, and then we can start making claims about organizations that were set up in that period. It's all so preposterous and so obviously misleading.
Counting forward from 607 BCE, 2,520 years takes us to the year 1914, the year that the 7 times ended and Jesus began ruling from heaven as King of God's kingdom. That began a period that the Bible calls the last days. Soon, Jesus will finish gathering the rest of his co-rulers to join him in heaven. God's kingdom will then undo every problem that afflicts us and our families. Imagine living there, under the rulership of a king who really cares about you.
So that's the video. And wow, just a flurry of nonsense towards the end there. Having made bad argument upon bad argument, presupposition upon presupposition, the viewer is just expected to think of 1914 as a date of significance, as, well, not just a date of significance, but the date that Jesus returned and started ruling invisibly in heaven. It's convenient that it's invisible, isn't it, if you think about it? Just going back to what they said earlier about nothing significant relating to God's rulership happened 7 years after 607. Jehovah's Witnesses here saying, oh, Jesus began ruling invisibly in heaven in 1914. This is an unfalsifiable claim. You could make that claim about any year, literally any year, and there would be no way to disprove it. So again, the manipulation is tangible here, and we've arrived at this completely flawed conclusion based on these preposterous arguments, all founded on a misinterpretation of an obscure Bible text in Daniel chapter 4 about a Babylonian king going crazy. So hopefully it kind of all speaks for itself at this point. Again, what does it say about an organization that would do this to people, that would just throw Bible verses at them that don't support the arguments they are making, or that pluck passages in the Bible out of context, in one case, even putting words in the mouth of Jesus? What does it say when you have to resort to those sorts of shady tactics, all to prop up a weird crackpot theology that was inherited from previous thinkers, previous Christian teachers in the 19th century. So hopefully, if you're a Jehovah's Witness watching this, I've given you a few things to think about. I do just want to pick up on one thing that gets said about the future paradise.
God's kingdom will then undo every problem that afflicts us and our families.
God's kingdom will then undo every problem that afflicts us and our families. Well, how will it do that, would be my question. Again, let's say you've been shown this video as a Bible student by a Jehovah's Witness teacher. My question to them would be, what's the solution for undoing all of the problems, all of the misery and cruelty and injustice on our planet? What really is the solution that's being presented? Please, can you actually describe for me what the actual plan is for doing that? And if you push your teacher on this, if you press a Jehovah's Witness on this, and they are honest, which they won't always be if I'm being honest, if you press them on this, the solution is genocide. We're going to fix the problem of evil with the biggest single act of evil the universe will ever have seen. The slaughter of billions of men, women, and children for the crime of not being Jehovah's Witnesses. That's genocide. You do not fix evil with evil. You know, two wrongs do not make a right. So I would ask you to just think about this if you are one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Even if we accept everything that's said in this video, which we shouldn't, because it's all based on bad arguments and presuppositions, but even if we accept everything and we indulge the makers of this video in their final concluding comments, how is it right that evil is corrected by more evil, by unimaginable slaughter? I mean, the slaughter of children. And you could say, oh, well, you know, maybe unbelieving children or children of unbelievers would be spared because they're just children. God's probably just going to kill their parents. Well, I don't think that's the teaching. But even if that were true, you're asking a child to spend the rest of eternity praising the God who's murdered its parents. So the whole grisly fantasy is multiple levels of messed up. But hopefully by going through this video, those of you who do hold on to Jehovah's Witness indoctrination will have food for thought and will have a basis for beginning to question how we even got here. Because again, this whole 1914 nonsense, the whole purpose behind it is quite obviously to prop up the governing body. Without 1914, you don't get 1919. Without 1919, you don't get the faithful slave teaching that Jesus appointed a faithful slave. Without that teaching, who are the governing body? They're just 8 dudes who appear on JW Broadcasting, in most cases in a foolish or incoherent manner. They're nobodies. So they need to sell all of these ludicrous ideas just to have some control, even if it means putting words in the mouth of Jesus, making obviously bad claims about the book of Daniel, and telling archaeologists and historians that they know better than them, that they know better than people who've dedicated their careers to learning about the ancient world. Oh, we're right and you're wrong. We know it was 607 BCE, even if you're saying it was 587 BCE. Such arrogance, if you think about it. And it's scary to think that I shared that arrogance at one time as a Jehovah's Witness. that I would have been willing to accept that my religion knows more about history than historians. So hopefully, again, I've given you some food for thought. 1914, or the teachings around 1914 as spread by Jehovah's Witnesses, are nonsense and easily debunked when we apply critical thinking. Anyway, that's all I have time for. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to subscribe to the Lloyd Evans channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.